"Pick that up, sweetheart." Those were the last words Katie Rodriguez heard before the tray clattered across the cafeteria floor. That was 2 weeks in the future. But first, there were the boots. They sat in her locker at Oak Creek Memorial in Denver, lace-tight, the leather cracked from desert heat and something darker staining the left toe. Katie had learned a long time ago not to look at that stain too carefully. Her hands trembled as she organized the supply closet on her first night shift, pushing boxes of sterile gauze to the back of the metal shelf. The tremor wasn't fear. It was muscle memory trying to wake up. Her body remembered things her security clearance insisted she forget. The cardiac unit at Oak Creek sat on the 4th floor, all white walls and the constant mechanical whisper of ventilators. Katie moved through it like a ghost, her sneakers silent on the polished linoleum, her scrubs 2 sizes too large to hide the map of scars running up her forearms. She'd been working as a contract nurse for 3 weeks when she noticed the discrepancies. First it was small. A phantom charge for 6 Siemens servo-I ventilator circuits that never arrived. Then a billing code for a cardiothoracic consultation that had no corresponding patient in the system. Then another. And another. By her 2nd week, Katie had filled a small notebook with serial numbers, timestamps, and equipment codes. She sat in the break room during her lunch break, comparing the supply inventory logs against the actual equipment in the equipment room. The numbers didn't match. $12,000 in phantom charges over 4 months. Her jaw tightened as she wrote down the discrepancies. The tremor in her hands had stopped. Her handwriting was precise, military precise, the way it used to be when she was filling out casualty reports in a tent outside Kandahar. That afternoon, Dr. Hargrove entered the break room. She didn't hear him come in. That was the problem. She should have heard him. Once, she would have heard him 3 rooms away. Now she was too tired, too careful, too buried in the life of Katie Rodriguez, night nurse, nobody important, nobody to worry about. Dr. Hargrove had silver hair that probably cost him $100 a month to maintain. His shoes were Italian leather, the kind that whispered when he walked instead of clicking. He was the cardiac unit director, which meant he signed the orders and approved the equipment purchases and controlled the supply budget. He was also, Katie was beginning to understand, stealing from Oak Creek Memorial in a way that was both elegant and systematic. She recognized the pattern because she'd seen similar ones in Baghdad, the way money moved in circles, the way audits got delayed, the way certain names never appeared on official rosters. "You're the new girl," he said. Not a question. Katie closed her notebook. She didn't rush. She didn't stammer. She turned to face him with the kind of composure that came from having been trained to operate under live fire, from having held a tourniquet on a teammate's thigh while mortars fell in the courtyard outside. "Katie Rodriguez," she said. Her voice was quiet. Deferential. The way she'd learned to sound at Oak Creek. His eyes dropped to the notebook in her lap. He smiled. It was the kind of smile that made the air in the room feel colder. "Eager beaver, aren't we? Keeping notes on everything." He sat down across from her, crossing his legs with the ease of a man who'd never worried about exits or sight lines. "That's the 3rd time I've seen you in the supply room at 2 in the morning. Reorganizing things. Taking inventory. You know nobody really cares about that stuff, right? The inventory log doesn't match the equipment," Katie said. She kept her tone neutral, professional. The tone of a contract nurse who had no history, no connections, no power. "I wanted to make sure we had accurate records." "The records are fine." Dr. Hargrove's smile didn't change, but his eyes went flat. This was a man who'd just realized something about her. Not yet what she was. But that she was asking questions he didn't want asked. His hand moved to the notebook. His fingers were soft, uncalloused, the hands of someone who'd never worked. He didn't touch it. He just stared at it like it was a snake. "You're a contract nurse. 3 weeks in. You've got temporary credentials and probably a temporary apartment somewhere. You think you understand how Oak Creek works." Katie didn't flinch. She'd learned a long time ago that flinching gave people information. I just noticed the discrepancies. Discrepancies. He stood up. His shadow fell across her like a blade. That's a word for it. Here's another word. Minding your own business. He walked to the door, his Italian shoes whispering against the tile. At the threshold, he turned back. His voice had dropped to something soft and dangerous, the kind of voice a shark might use if it could talk. You seem smart. You seem observant. Don't be observant here. Observation has a way of not working out for contract nurses. He left. Katie's hand started to shake again. But not with fear. With the kind of adrenaline that came before a decision was made. She'd recognized what she was looking at. A man with institutional power. A man with connections. A man who'd just let her know he was watching. The question now was whether he would try to ignore her or whether he would try to remove her. She suspected she already knew the answer. That night, Katie worked her shift in the cardiac unit, checking drains on post-op thoracotomy patients, monitoring EKG tracings, pushing medications with a kind of precision that came from having done it 1,000 times before. Her colleague Marcus, a day shift nurse who'd been at Oak Creek for 6 years, stopped by her station around 11 p.m. He was carrying a stack of charts and looked exhausted. "You notice anything weird about Hargrove?" he asked. Katie glanced up from the medication cart. "Weird how?" "I mean, he's always been kind of an ass. But there's something off about the supply orders lately. I mentioned it to the procurement department and got shut down pretty quick." Marcus set the charts down. His voice dropped. "Like, aggressively shut down. Like someone made a call." "What kind of call?" Katie asked. "The kind where a procurement director suddenly remembers they don't have time to investigate irregularities in an established physician's orders. The kind where it becomes somebody else's problem." Marcus rubbed his eyes. "I've got 15 years in, so nobody's going to push me around." "But you're new." "Just FYI. Don't make enemies here." Katie nodded. She wrote down 3 more medication times in the chart. Her handwriting was still precise. Still military. She'd gotten good at hiding it, but Marcus had seen it. She could tell by the way his eyes lingered on the perfect block letters, the way a man trained in observation might look at something that didn't fit the pattern. The next morning, as Katie was leaving her shift, as she was walking past the nurse's station with her badge clipped to her scrubs and her coffee in one hand, Dr. Hargrove was standing with 3 other physicians. They were discussing the weekly supply budget. One of them made a joke about contract nurses who didn't understand hospital procedure. Hargrove laughed. It was a real laugh, the kind that came from genuine amusement. He glanced at Katie as she passed. "Hey, new girl," he called out. His voice carried across the station, loud enough that everyone turned to look. "I've got a question for you." Katie stopped. She turned. Her composure was perfect. Ice water in a vein, that's what her training officer used to call it. The ability to stand still when every instinct was screaming to move. "I'm actually thinking of putting together a little wager," Hargrove said. His colleagues were grinning now. They understood they were about to watch something. "With the staff. See how long the new contract nurses last here. I'm thinking, what, 7 days? 10. He looked at Katie directly. His smile was a weapon. "What do you think? How long do you think you'll last?" The room went dead silent. Katie could hear the ventilators in the ICU 2 rooms away. Could hear the fluorescent lights buzzing their electrical song. Could hear the sound of a monitor alarming softly in bed 3, a rhythm that needed adjustment but wasn't critical. Could hear, underneath all of it, the sound of an institution protecting itself, closing ranks against someone asking questions about money that wasn't supposed to be questioned. "I don't know," Katie said. Her voice was quiet. It was the voice of a woman who had nowhere to go, no power, no weight in the world. It was also, underneath that, the voice of someone who had held lives together with her bare hands. But nobody in that room would ever hear that part. Not yet. I guess we'll find out. Hargrove's smile widened. He'd gotten what he wanted. He'd established dominance. He'd let her know that he was the apex predator in this territory and she was just a nurse, just a contract worker, just someone temporary enough to disappear without anyone asking too many questions. He turned back to his colleagues and resumed his conversation about golf. Katie walked out of Oak Creek Memorial as the sun was coming up over Denver. She could see the Rocky Mountains in the distance, purple with distance. She could smell the cold morning air, could feel the weight of her credentials in her pocket, credentials that said she was nobody, records that said she'd never been anything more than a contract nurse, documents that carefully, systematically, denied everything she actually was. She thought about the combat boots in her locker. She thought about the way her hands had shaken while organizing supplies. She thought about Dr. Hargrove's smile and the institutional power he wielded like a knife. She thought about her daughter at home, waiting for her to come home, the girl who knew her mother was a nurse but didn't know her mother was also something else. Something classified. Something buried so deep that even Katie's own service record had been erased from existence. The question now was simple. How long before Dr. Hargrove realized who he was actually looking at? The morning staff meeting had that particular flavor of exhaustion that belonged only to hospitals at dawn, 20 nurses and residents crammed into a conference room that smelled like burned coffee and the kind of fluorescent brightness that made everyone look slightly deceased. Katie sat near the back, her notebook open, her posture the careful composition of someone who'd learned long ago that visibility was dangerous. Dr. Hargrove stood at the head of the table in his pressed white coat, clicking through budget slides with the casual confidence of a man who'd never been told no in his entire life. The slides blurred past. Quarterly expenses. Supply chain optimization. Phantom line items that made Katie's chest tighten, invoices for equipment that didn't exist, consultant fees billed to names that didn't appear anywhere else in the hospital system. She'd been cross-referencing them against the actual purchase orders for 3 days now, watching the discrepancies grow like a pattern only she could see. Her hand went up. The room didn't exactly quiet. It just shifted, the way a predator's attention shifts when something moves in the tall grass. Dr. Hargrove, I noticed the supply invoices for last month's show. He cut her off with a theatrical sigh that seemed to take up all the oxygen in the room. His voice dropped into that particular register of casual cruelty, the kind that sounds almost affectionate if you weren't paying attention. Does anyone want to take bets on how long Nightingale here lasts? The nickname landed like a slap. I'm giving her 7 days. Mark your calendars. Laughter rippled through the room. Not comfortable laughter. The uncertain kind, the laughter of people who sensed blood in the water and weren't sure whether to flee or join the feeding. Katie watched faces she'd worked beside, residents she'd helped through double shifts, nurses she'd covered for when their kids got sick, they all looked away. She took one measured breath, her hands flat on the table. A single tear escaped down her cheek but she didn't move to wipe it away. Let it fall. Let it prove she was human, at least. I just wanted to clarify the discrepancies, Doctor, she said quietly. Hargrove leaned back, his expression the kind of satisfied that comes from seeing someone smaller flinch. Discrepancies, he mocked, drawing out each syllable like he was explaining colors to someone colorblind. That's adorable. 7 days, people. Maybe 6 if we're lucky. The meeting continued around her. Supply chain optimization became supply chain indifference. Katie wrote nothing else down. 2 days later. The cafeteria during lunch rush, chaos orchestrated in steel and steam. Trays clattering, voices echoing off tile walls like gunshots in a canyon, the smell of industrial chicken broth and something deeper underneath, the copper-tinged scent of blood from the trauma bay's laundry carts being wheeled through the service entrance. Katie carried her tray past the doctor's table, just trying to get to a quiet corner near the windows where she could eat and be invisible. Dr. Hargrove sat with 2 of the board members, his laugh cutting through the noise like a surgical saw through bone. He extended his foot. The tray flew from her hands. Physics and gravity completed their work with brutal efficiency, mac and cheese exploding across the floor in an orange wave, her apple rolling toward the ice machine like it was trying to escape, her drink spreading in a sticky puddle that smelled like artificial orange and broken plans. The cafeteria didn't go quiet immediately. It took a moment for everyone to understand what they'd seen. Then it did. That particular quality of silence that comes right before something changes forever. Hargrove reached over and grabbed her patient charts from her other hand, 5 folders representing hours of careful documentation, medication reconciliations, vital sign trends. He tossed them into the mess with a gesture that was almost lazy, almost kind. Pages soaked up orange soda. Ink began to blur and run like watercolor painting someone had decided to destroy. He leaned down, his voice loud enough for the whole cafeteria to hear it, the way you'd speak to a dog that hadn't learned to sit yet. "Pick that up, sweetheart. That's what you're good for." Katie knelt slowly. Not quickly. Not with anger burning through her. Slowly, deliberately, the way a sniper moves into position, every motion controlled, every breath measured. She gathered the soggy papers, cheese sauce staining the cuffs of her scrubs, her hand steady even though they were wet. Around her, phones came out. Someone was recording. She could feel the red dot of someone's camera phone tracking her from across the room, and she didn't care. Let them record. Let them see what this looked like. Let them carry it with them. She stood, her scrubs ruined, her charts destroyed, her dignity distributed across 15 feet of cafeteria tile. She met Hargrove's eyes with the kind of devastating calm that comes from having stared down much worse than a doctor with a god complex and a paycheck that made him feel immortal. "I've cleaned up bigger messes than this, doctor." His smile didn't reach his eyes. His eyes were the eyes of someone who'd just realized they were playing a game with rules they didn't understand. The moment held, 3 seconds maybe, long enough for everyone in the cafeteria to see that something had shifted, something fundamental had cracked in the universe he'd built where he was always the largest person in the room. "Get out of my sight," he said finally, but the heat had gone out of it. Katie walked. Not rushed. Not ashamed. The kind of walk that suggested she had somewhere better to be, and everyone in that cafeteria knew it, even if they couldn't name the reason. Her daughter's recital was Thursday. Hargrove would try to make sure she couldn't attend. That was coming. She could feel it approaching like weather. The next morning, Katie arrived for her shift to find her locker assigned to someone else, a third-year resident named Martinez whose name was printed on a fresh label beside the lock. Her boots, the worn combat boots that had carried her through for deployments and Baghdad and nights she would never be allowed to discuss, had been placed in a plastic bag on the bench. Just left there. Not thrown. That would have been too obvious. Just abandoned, the way you'd leave something you'd borrowed and were returning because you didn't want it anymore. The charge nurse, a woman named Rodriguez who'd been kind to her for the past 2 weeks, handed her an assignment sheet. Her eyes wouldn't focus on Katie's face. "Hargrove says you're being moved to night rotation permanently. No more day shifts. He says it's for staff development." It wasn't staff development. It was a cage. Night shift was graveyard work, isolated from the main flow of the hospital, working with skeleton crews and minimal oversight. It was a message, you don't belong here. It was the first move in something larger, something that was just beginning. Katie's phone buzzed in her pocket before she even left the locker room. A text from her daughter, Sophia, 12 years old and still believing her mother was a regular person with a regular job. Katie stared at the message. The boots hung heavy in her hands. She typed back, "I'll be there. But the words felt like lies, and she'd stopped tolerating lies a long time ago. She deleted it. Typed, "something came up at work. I'm sorry. Then deleted that too. Finally, just, "I love you. And sent it. The trauma bay doors exploded inward at 2 in the morning. 200 hours on a hospital clock, which meant the worst was happening to someone, somewhere in Denver, and Oak Creek Memorial was about to bear witness to it. Paramedics wheeled in a Navy SEAL transferred from Walter Reed, his chest wrapped in pressure dressings that were already soaking through, the monitor screaming its particular language of desperation, heart rate climbing, blood pressure dropping, the oxygen saturation numbers that meant his lungs were trying to quit. Katie was starting an 4 on a drunk driver in Bay 2 when she heard the alert. She finished the line, muscle memory took over, her hands finding the vein with absolute certainty, and she was moving before anyone could assign her. The attending was Dr. Chen, a second-year resident who looked like he was trying very hard not to panic and failing at it with increasing competence. GSW to the chest, 2 units given in transport, BP dropping, the lead paramedic shouted over the monitors screaming. 120 over 80 and falling. A second SEAL stood against the wall in full tactical gear, face painted, rifle slung across his chest like he'd stepped out of a war zone and straight into this fluorescent bright bay without transition. His eyes tracked every person who touched his teammate like he was cataloging threats. Katie moved automatically, cutting away the dressing, her fingers finding the anatomy underneath with certainty that shouldn't have belonged to a contract nurse on night shift. Breath sounds diminished on the left, Chen said, his stethoscope shaking slightly in his hands. Katie already had the ultrasound probe ready. She positioned it in the 4th intercostal space, and the screen told the story in grayscale, absent lung sliding. Tension pneumothorax. The patient's lung had collapsed. The air trapped in his chest cavity was pushing against his heart like an invisible fist. He had minutes, maybe less. She reached for the decompression kit without waiting for an order, her movements fluid and precise and utterly, completely wrong for someone who'd never done this outside of a textbook. The teammate stepped forward. His eyes locked on her hands, not her face, her hands. Watching her technique like he was reading text written in muscle memory. "Wait," he said. His voice was strange, fractured. He stopped. Katie prepped the chest, her fingers finding the second intercostal space at the midclavicular line with absolute certainty. No hesitation. No consultation. She positioned the needle, 14-gauge angiocath, and pushed through the ribs. The hiss of air escaping rushed out like a held breath finally released. The monitor's pitch changed immediately. The blood pressure numbers began to climb. "That's a couple running stitch," the teammate said quietly. "Where the hell did you learn forward surgical?" Katie's hands didn't pause. She was securing the needle, verifying placement, moving to the next step in a sequence that lived in her bones. "I need more light here," she said to Chen, not answering. Never answering. Never acknowledging. The teammate pulled out his phone. He stepped into the hallway, and through the glass partition, Katie saw him make a call. Saw his lips form a name she hadn't heard in 5 years, a name that belonged to a different woman, a woman who wasn't pushing a medical cart and wearing scrubs stained with mac and cheese and other people's blood. Rodriguez. He was calling someone. He was calling her. The patient stabilized. The teammate disappeared into the hallway, and Katie could hear his voice, low, urgent, the cadence of a military communication. Chen stared at her like she'd just revealed she was fluent in a language she'd never studied. "How did you know to?" he started, but Katie was already walking away, her hands starting to shake now that they weren't needed anymore, now that the emergency had passed and her body could finally acknowledge the cost of what she'd just done. The trauma bay doors exploded open at 0200 hours, and the world compressed into the space between heartbeats. A Navy SEAL named Morrison lay on the stretcher, his chest wrapped in pressure dressings that looked like they'd been applied in a moving vehicle, his monitors screaming in a chorus that made the fluorescent light seem to flicker in sympathy. Chest tubes, multiple full lines, the smell of diesel fuel and antiseptic mixing into something that made Katie's throat tighten. This was Walter Reed transfer protocol. This was bad. The attending physician, Dr. Chen, not Hargrove, thank God, though that mercy felt temporary, was already moving, already barking orders about blood products and imaging. Katie stood in the corner of the trauma bay where she'd been reassigned to make room for the day shift, ostensibly observing, actually invisible. She'd worn her scrubs precisely because invisibility was the only shield left to her after the cafeteria. After the boots in the plastic bag. After that devastating calm sentence that had made Hargrove's jaw tighten in a way that promised retaliation. But invisibility shattered the moment Morrison's chest wall opened for the exploratory thoracotomy. Dr. Chen's hands were competent but mechanical, moving through the procedure like he'd read it in a textbook rather than lived it. Katie watched him open the left chest, the ribs spreading like a cage surrendering, the heart visible now, the source of the bleeding a laceration along the left anterior descending artery. The wound was massive. The bleeding was controlled only by pressure dressing and sheer luck. He needed sutures. He needed hands that had done this before while mortars fell and the electricity cut out and the only light was a headlamp with a dying battery. Katie moved without deciding to move. Her body remembered. That was the danger and the necessity of it all. She was already gloved, already positioned, already reaching for the 4.0 running suture before anyone had fully registered her presence. The needle felt like home. The tension in her fingers was muscle memory, not nervousness, the kind of steady that only came from having sutured bleeding vessels while lying flat on the ground with shrapnel fragmenting the wall 3 feet above her head. She tied the knots with the specific technique they drilled into her at every forward surgical team rotation, the couple running stitch that stayed secure even when the patient was jostled during medevac, even when infection was inevitable and you were just buying time. 1 pass. 2 passes. The bleeding stopped. Morrison's heart continued its frantic rhythm on the monitor, but it was beating, and that was the difference between a funeral and a fighting chance. The room was holding its breath. Katie realized it only because she was holding hers too. Then Chen's teammate, the one they'd called Chen but who was actually Lieutenant Mitchell, the one with the scar that ran from his left temple to his jawline like a map of every close call he'd survived, stepped closer. His eyes locked onto Katie's hands. Specifically onto the suture technique. Specifically onto the way she was securing the final knot with the precision of someone who'd done this not in a sterile OR but in the dark, under fire, with human lives stacked around her like cordwood. "That's a couple running stitch," Mitchell said. His voice was quiet. His voice was terrified. "Where the hell did you learn forward surgical?" Katie tied off the final knot. She didn't look up. She didn't look at him. She stepped back from the table, peeled off her gloves, and walked to the corner of the bay where she'd been standing before, where she was supposed to be, where she was nothing and no one. "I watched it on YouTube," she said. Her voice was steady. Her voice was a lie. "You guys do good work." Mitchell stared at her like she'd just told him the moon was made of cheese and he could see the evidence. His mouth opened. Closed. Opened again. But Dr. Chen was already moving him along, already barking about post-op protocols and ICU prep, and there was no time for questions because Morrison was still bleeding and the heart was still racing and the monitors were still screaming. By 0800, Morrison was stable in the ICU. Katie had clocked out at 0700, had driven home through Denver streets that were just beginning to gray with dawn, had sat at her kitchen table watching her daughter sleep on the couch in front of a muted television, her homework scattered across the coffee table like evidence of a life that was slowly coming apart. She didn't sleep. She couldn't sleep. She lay in bed for 3 hours thinking about Lieutenant Mitchell's face, about the specific way his pupils had dilated when he recognized what her hands could do, about how long it would take before someone traced that back to something that shouldn't exist anymore. When her phone buzzed at 1100, a text from the temp agency saying her shift had been extended, she was doing great, see you tonight, Katie felt something that might have been relief or might have been resignation. She showered. She dressed. She put on her scrubs that still smelled faintly of Morrison's blood and antiseptic. What she didn't do was sleep. The morning rounds at 1000 hours started normally. Morrison was extubated, his oxygen saturation stable at 94, his heart rate in the low 90s, his blood pressure holding at 118/70. He was the kind of stable that made doctors nod approvingly and nurses exhale. He was the kind of stable that felt like victory, even though everyone knew he was only stable because of luck and because someone had stitched his heart back together at 0200 in the morning while the hospital around him slept. Katie was there for the wound assessment because that was her job now, the invisible night nurse who did the grunt work while the real medical staff operated in daylight hours. She was checking the chest tube output, documenting the color and consistency, when she noticed something that made her spine straighten like she'd felt electricity. Morrison's left chest wall was rising more than his right chest wall. The rise was subtle, the kind of asymmetry that might go unnoticed by someone who wasn't trained to look for it. But Katie had spent for years watching combat trauma, for years reading the body's language when it was failing, for years understanding that the smallest physical changes could mean the difference between a patient who lived and a patient who died in the next 10 minutes. "Doctor," Katie said. Her voice was level. "We need to check the trachea." Dr. Chen, who was writing in Morrison's chart and thinking about his next coffee, looked up with mild irritation. "The trachea's midline. He's stable." Katie looked at Morrison's neck. The trachea had deviated. It was subtle, but it was there, a slight push to the right, which meant pressure building on the left, which meant tension pneumothorax, which meant Morrison's remaining lung was collapsing and his heart was being pushed out of position and he was going to code in the next 4 to 6 minutes if the pressure wasn't released immediately. "Doctor, the patient is in tension pneumothorax," Katie said. This time her voice wasn't a request. This time her voice was a statement of medical fact that didn't require debate. But Dr. Chen froze. His pen hung in the air. His eyes went to Morrison, whose face was already taking on that grayish cast, whose oxygen saturation was already starting to drop, 94, 91, 88. The attending's mouth opened. His hand reached for the crash cart, but his movements were slow, uncertain, the movements of someone who'd only read about this in a textbook rather than lived it. Katie was already moving. She'd already grabbed the 14-gauge angiocath needle from the crash cart, already palpated Morrison's chest wall for the second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line, already pushed the needle through skin and muscle and pleura until she felt the subtle give, the moment when the needle breached into the pressurized cavity. The hiss of escaping air was the most beautiful sound in the world. The hiss was Morrison's life expanding back into his chest. O2 sat climbed. 88, 90. 92, 94. Katie withdrew the needle, left the catheter in place, applied the dressing, stepped back. She didn't ask for permission. She didn't wait for approval. She did what needed to be done because that was what you did when you were trained to do it and everyone around you had frozen. Dr. Chen stared at her like she'd performed a miracle with a kitchen knife. "Who," he said slowly, "are you?" Katie documented the procedure time in Morrison's chart, 1,047 hours. She documented the vital sign response. She documented the catheter size and location and the immediate clinical improvement. She didn't document the fact that she'd just performed an emergency procedure that was absolutely outside the scope of practice for a contract staff nurse, and absolutely consistent with someone who'd done it before, and absolutely incriminating in every possible way. By noon, Dr. Hargrove had arrived in the hospital administrator's office carrying a stack of papers and a smile that looked like it was made of broken glass. Katie could see him through the frosted glass wall from her position at the nurse's station, could see him pacing like a predator, could see him on the phone with his voice carrying through the hallway in fragments that made her stomach descend. Unauthorized procedure. Hargrove's voice was a knife edge. Credential falsification. Yes, I'm certain. Yes, I have witnesses. By 1300 hours, 3 board members had arrived. By 1400, the state nursing board investigator was in the hospital administrator's office, and Katie's personnel file was spread across the table like an autopsy. What happened next didn't just silence the room, it ended careers. By 1400 hours, the state nursing board investigator had already spread Katie's personnel file across the administrator's desk like evidence at a crime scene. Dr. Hargrove didn't wait for the formal review. He moved with the efficiency of a man who understood institutional power, the kind built on favors owed and careers balanced on a knife's edge. His first call went to board member Sterling at 14:07. "We have a credential issue," Hargrove said, his voice smooth as surgical glue. "Contract nurse, suspicious certifications, unauthorized procedures in the ICU this morning. I'm protecting the hospital's liability." Sterling didn't ask questions. 20 years of mutual back-scratching meant Sterling didn't need to. "I'll make calls," Sterling said. Consider it handled. The second call went to board member Pierce at 1419. Same script, different number. Pierce owed Hargrove $3,000 on a gambling debt covered up through hospital petty cash. This was payment. The third board member, Hayes, answered on the first ring because he was currently billing the hospital for a consulting fee he'd never earned, a number that hit $47,000 last month alone. By 1435, Hargrove had contacted Katie's references at the temp agency. She'd worked there for 9 months under a carefully constructed identity, vaccination records filed, social security number real but flagged in one database as inactive, birth certificate from a state office that had lost to fire in 2003. The temp agency coordinator didn't ask why Hargrove was calling. Hargrove had referred 200 nurses to Oak Creek in the past 3 years. He had power here. We're finding some irregularities, he told the coordinator. Don't place her anywhere else pending investigation. The investigator arrived at 1502, a woman named Diane Crossley who had built her career on finding exactly what clients paid her to find. Hargrove led her to the personnel file, the credential copies, the background check reports. Look at the gaps, he said, pointing to Katie's employment history. This doesn't add up. And this morning she performed an advanced needle decompression procedure. We have it on video from the trauma bay. A contract nurse shouldn't have that skill set. Crossley was already taking notes. Where did she train? That's what we need to find out, Hargrove said. I suspect fraudulent credentials. Maybe an expired license she's hiding. By 1530, Crossley had typed her preliminary report, credential falsification, unauthorized advanced procedures, possible endangerment. The language was clinical and devastating. Based on the procedural video evidence and credential discrepancies, Ms. Rodriguez's license should be flagged pending full state review, the report concluded. Security arrived at Katie's station at 1545 with the kind of quiet efficiency that meant HR had already documented everything. 2 officers, both professional, neither meeting her eyes. We need you to come with us, one said. Not a request. Katie stood, her hand steady, her face a mask of calm that revealed nothing. The charge nurse watched from across the unit, confusion blooming into understanding, then into horror. Her locker was open in the break room. The investigator stood beside it, photographing each item. Katie's water bottle. A protein bar. And at the bottom, wrapped in a plastic grocery bag to protect them from the humidity of the hospital, her combat boots, worn canvas soft as skin, the leather cracked and stained with things she would never name. Desert sand was embedded in the treads. There were scuffs that matched mortar shrapnel from a courtyard in Fallujah. One heel bore a mark from where she'd kicked open a door to reach a bleeder. Those yours? The security officer asked. Katie didn't answer. She watched as they placed the boots in a plastic bag like evidence. She watched as they handed the bag to her, this plastic monument to a life she wasn't supposed to have lived. The parking lot was cool, the Denver autumn cutting through her scrubs like accusation. She sat in her car for 11 minutes without starting the engine. Her hands gripped the plastic bag containing the boots. The bag crinkled with each breath she took. She could see the hospital from here, the windows reflecting afternoon light, the ER entrance where she'd pulled a Navy SEAL back from the edge of death hours before. She drove home to the house with the blue shutters in the Cherry Creek neighborhood. Neighborhood kids played basketball on the corner. A dog barked at her car. Everything was aggressively normal, which meant everything was obscene. Emma should be at school for another 2 hours. Katie's shift didn't end until 2300. The house felt foreign in daylight, a place designed for sleeping, not for sitting at the kitchen table at 1823 with a plastic bag of combat boots and a future that had just evaporated. She didn't cry. She hadn't cried since the operation in Baghdad. But her hands betrayed her, gripping the edge of the table hard enough that her knuckles went white. The boots sat on the table in front of her, boots that had walked through rooms where people bled out, boots that had stood over a medic's tray while she'd held someone's spleen in her hands and willed them back from the other side. Boots that should not exist in this house with blue shutters where she was supposed to be just a nurse named Katie who'd never fired a weapon or heard mortar rounds land close enough to throw her across a courtyard. The front door opened at 18:51. Emma came through like she always did, backpack first, shoes half untied, homework already forgotten. But she stopped, seeing her mother at the table. "Mom? Why are you home? Your shift doesn't..." Emma's voice trailed off. She saw her mother's face. The kitchen filled with a silence so complete it had weight. Katie couldn't speak. The words wouldn't assemble. How do you explain to a 12-year-old that she doesn't legally exist, that her mother was buried alive by the government, that the identity her daughter knew was built on papers so false that even mentioning them aloud could constitute espionage? Emma sat down slowly across from her mother. Her eyes found the plastic bag, the combat boots inside, the dark stains on the leather. "Mom, what happened?" Emma's voice was small, the voice of a child understanding that something had shifted beneath the floor. Katie looked at her daughter and could not speak. She reached for Emma's hand instead. Her palms were calloused from 12 years of procedures, her fingers shaped by muscle memory that no permanent personnel file could ever erase. Emma gripped her mother's hand and waited. "It's okay," Emma whispered, though she had no idea what wasn't okay, only that her mother's hands were shaking and the boots on the table looked like evidence from something that couldn't possibly be true. "Mom, it's going to be okay." Katie closed her eyes. In her mind she was in a courtyard in Baghdad, the sound of the VBIED still ringing, David Morrison on her left going pale, blood blooming across his kit, her hands already moving toward the trauma shears hanging from her neck. She'd made the choice then that had led directly to this kitchen table, to these boots on the table like a life she couldn't claim, to her daughter's confusion and her own silence. That night, after Emma finally fell asleep on the couch, Katie laid out all 12 years on the kitchen table like evidence, the medical discharge papers that had no medical reason listed, the NPO document marked classified, the photograph of the mortuary truck marked cannot be retained, the commendation letter with every detail redacted so thoroughly it looked like a ransom note. And the boots. Always the boots. She didn't sleep. She sat in the dark and waited for whatever came next, because she knew something was coming. The universe didn't allow you to pull a Navy SEAL back from death and then slip quietly into obscurity. There was always a reckoning. There was always a cost. The first indication came at 0247 when her phone, a burner, classified network enabled, the number known to exactly 14 people, buzzed with a text, CH-47S staging. ETA 0800. Remain at residence. Katie stared at the message. She read it 3 times. Then she deleted it, which did nothing. The message had already been sent through channels that existed in databases and government buildings that didn't appear on maps. At 0800 hours, the rotor wash hit first, the sound arriving before the aircraft themselves, a percussion that vibrated through the windows of the house with blue shutters, through the walls, through Katie's chest cavity where shrapnel had been left in place because surgeons agreed that removal would cause more damage than retention. Emma bolted upright on the couch, terrified. "Mom." "Helicopter," Katie said. She moved to the window and watched as 3 Black Hawks descended toward Oak Creek Memorial in perfect formation, their rotors throwing wind and rain across the parking lot in waves. She'd ridden in identical aircraft 14 times. She knew exactly how many seconds it took to get from the skids touching ground to boots hitting pavement. She'd never expected them to come back for her. The rotor wash hit the parking lot at 0800 hours like a storm front rolling across the mountains. Windows rattled on 4 floors. Car alarms screamed. Dust rose in a spiral column as the first Black Hawk settled its skids onto the asphalt, followed by 2 more in perfect formation, their side doors already open before the rotors stopped turning. 150 operators in full combat kit descended like a wave, their body armor catching the morning light, their faces obscured by the same tactical precision that had shaped Katie's hands for 12 years. The lead team entered through the main entrance while staff froze mid-stride. The team leader's boot struck tile with the sound of destiny announcing itself, 1, 2, 3, 4, and he moved toward the front desk with the fluid certainty of someone who had spent 3,000 hours planning his next 60 seconds. His call sign was Breaker, earned in Fallujah when he'd extracted 8 Marines from a collapsed building with nothing but a Halligan bar and pure will. He did not ask. He announced. Senior Chief Rodriguez. I'm here to collect her. The desk clerk's mouth opened. Closed. She reached for her phone with trembling fingers. In a classroom at Denver Central High, Katie's daughter Emma sat in third period AP Biology, her phone hidden in her lap, scrolling through a news alert that made the blood drain from her face. 3 Black Hawks. 150 soldiers. And the crawling text at the bottom of the screen, armed military presence at Oak Creek Memorial, details emerging. Then she saw the hospital name. Then she saw the phrase that made her hands shake, Special Forces unit arriving at Denver Hospital, unclear situation. Emma's thumbs moved without permission from her brain. The message appeared on Katie's old work phone, the one she kept in her car for emergencies, the one she hadn't answered in 40 hours. Mom, why are they calling you Senior Chief? In the administrator's office, Breaker opened a folder marked TSSCI, Top Secret Sensitive Compartmented Information. The pages were redacted in places, the black ink obscuring the full weight of what had been written. His voice carried through the doorway into the hallway where 30 staff members had drifted, drawn by the unmistakable vibration of authority, the sound of something enormous about to shift. Dr. Hargrove stood in the office doorway, his face already beginning to lose color, already sensing the temperature in the room had dropped below survival range. Senior Chief Petty Officer Katie Rodriguez, Breaker began, each word landing like a boot step on concrete. SEAL Team 3, Charlie Platoon. Deployed to Baghdad, Sadr City District, November 2015. During a vehicle-borne improvised explosive device attack near Route Karada, she was hit by shrapnel from the secondary blast while shielding operator Morrison. Continued operating for 4 hours with metal fragments in her abdomen and advanced shock markers, performing emergency medical intervention on 3 soldiers while maintaining her position under sporadic small arms fire. Saved 11 lives before she collapsed from blood loss and hypoxic shock. The hallway had gone quiet. The fluorescent lights hummed their electric hymn. 2 bronze stars with Valor. Purple Heart. Breaker's voice did not rise. It did not need to. She was ordered to disappear. Ordered to abandon her service record, her rank, her identity. Classified black site operations, Pentagon Directive, SAP Protection, Special Access Program. She was told never to surface, never to claim her service, never to wear the uniform again. And she complied. Dr. Hargrove's mouth opened. Closed. Opened again, searching for language that did not exist. Senior Chief Rodriguez did not refuse her orders, Breaker continued, turning the page. She did not fight back. She accepted a contract position at this hospital, knowing she would never be recognized, never be thanked, never be believed. She saved Operator Morrison's life yesterday morning with a needle decompression for tension pneumothorax, a procedure that required her to override 12 years of muscle memory, a procedure she learned to perform under mortar fire, a procedure she can execute better than 98% of the emergency physicians in this country. The general appeared in the doorway then, 2 stars on his shoulder, the Pentagon's personal messenger, the kind of human whose presence made the air pressure change. His name was Garrison, and he had personally signed Katie's original classification order. He had ordered her to disappear. He had come to undo that order. Dr. Hargrove, the general said, and it was not a greeting. You fired Senior Chief Rodriguez yesterday for performing an emergency procedure that saved the life of a Navy SEAL. A procedure she was qualified to perform. A procedure your attending physician failed to execute. You then activated a network of board members and external investigators to fabricate disciplinary issues. You called in favors. You brought in the State Nursing Board. You had a decorated combat veteran escorted from this building by security for doing her job. Hargrove's hands had begun to shake. Not with rage. With the specific terror that comes from understanding you have made an irreversible mistake. Her records are classified, the general continued, his voice steady as a laser sight. She was ordered never to surface. She followed those orders while you destroyed her career. Morrison appeared then, moving on crutches down the hallway, his left side bandaged from thoracic cavity to hip, his face pale but his eyes burning with the kind of clarity that comes from having been dead for 4 minutes and then not dead. He positioned himself in the doorway across from Hargrove, and when he spoke, his voice carried the weight of resurrection. "Sir, I'd like to address Dr. Hargrove, if the General permits." The General nodded. "Doctor, you called me a liar. Called Senior Chief's credentials fake. Called her training questionable." Morrison shifted his weight on the crutches, the movement clearly expensive in terms of pain. "I watched her hand shake when she was in your hospital. Watched her use every ounce of control not to let the fear show. She has metal in her abdomen from a blast designed to kill both of us. The metal shifts when she moves. It causes chronic pain that most people would spend their life medicated to manage. She doesn't take medication. She doesn't complain. She just absorbs it and keeps moving." Morrison's eyes locked on Hargrove's. "Then my lung collapsed. And her hand stopped shaking. She overrode her own nervous system through sheer force of will because my life depended on it. You know what kind of training produces that response? You know how many hours of surgical instruction it takes to operate under that kind of pressure? She didn't just save my life yesterday, Doctor. She saved it in Baghdad too. And then she buried her own existence to follow orders you will never understand." A reporter shouted from the hallway, a question about federal involvement, about arrest warrants, about scandal. The General ignored it. "Effective immediately, Dr. Richard Hargrove, you are relieved of all duties at Oak Creek Memorial." The General's voice carried no heat. Heat was unnecessary. "Your clinical privileges are suspended pending investigation by federal law enforcement." The hospital administrator stepped forward, his face the color of spoiled milk. "General, I don't have the authority to." "You do now." A woman in a dark suit appeared, FBI credentials hanging from a lanyard, her presence carrying the weight of 3 federal agencies in conversation. "We've been investigating financial irregularities at Oak Creek Memorial for 6 months, she said, looking directly at Hargrove. "Phantom equipment charges. Ghost consultations. Insurance fraud. Total value of fraudulent billing, $2,340,000. Your supply inventory documentation has been extremely helpful." She looked at Katie, invisible in the crowd, and nodded. Hargrove's hands had stopped shaking. They had started clenching instead, his knuckles white, his breath coming in short gasps. "You can't do this," he said. His voice was not a voice anymore. It was the sound of a cliff collapsing into the ocean. "You can't just." The administrator cut his hospital credentials in half with a pair of scissors. The plastic cracked loud in the silence, a sound like the snapping of a spine. News cameras caught every frame. Dr. Richard Hargrove, the FBI agent said, producing handcuffs with the casual efficiency of someone who had performed this act 100 times before, "You're under arrest for healthcare fraud, insurance fraud, and obstruction of justice. You have the right to remain silent." They walked him out through the corridor. Past the staff he had once commanded. Past the residents he had humiliated. Past the nurses he had called incompetent. A junior nurse whispered something under her breath, a word that sounded like "sweetheart," thrown back with the precision of a sniper shot. Someone laughed. It started quiet, built slowly, became inevitable. By the time Hargrove reached the main entrance, the laughter was general and merciless, the sound of institutional power reversing itself, the sound of karma executing a perfect landing. 6 months later, someone spotted Dr. Richard Hargrove at Denver Community College, teaching CPR certification courses for minimum wage, his medical license suspended pending criminal trial, his house sold to cover legal fees, his name reduced to a footnote in healthcare fraud prosecution records that would follow him for the rest of his life. The students didn't know who he used to be. They didn't need to. Katie stood on the hospital roof at sunrise, the city painted gold and crimson, her combat boots laced tight over her scrubs. The boots were clean now, the blood finally washed away, but she could still see the stains if she looked close enough. Below, the city was waking. Traffic moved on I-25. People rushed toward jobs that mattered to them. The normal world, continuing without pause, because that was what the normal world did. Then Emma appeared in the stairwell doorway, bringing her mother coffee before school, her dark eyes carrying the weight of a daughter who had discovered her mother was a war hero and had kept it secret for reasons she was still learning to understand. Emma was wearing dog tags now, Katie's dog tags, the ones that had arrived with the formal apology from the Pentagon, the ones that came with a classification review and an official reinstatement of service record. "Mom, they're asking for you in the ER," Emma said. Katie nodded, took the coffee from her daughter's hands, pulled her into a brief fierce hug that conveyed 12 years of apologies in less than 10 seconds. "I'll be back before shift change." Emma smiled, a real smile, not the worried one Katie had seen for the past 6 months. "I know you will." Below, the medevac doors opened. Katie could see the patient from the roof, could see the blood, the organized chaos of trauma reception. The new cardiac unit director, Dr. Chen, a resident who had watched the entire reckoning unfold, looked up at the roof, saw Katie's silhouette against the sunrise, raised a hand in acknowledgement that needed no translation. Katie took a sip of the coffee Emma had brought, savoring the moment of stillness before the machinery of emergency medicine demanded everything she had to give. She still worked nights sometimes. Still kept the combat boots in her locker. Still felt the shrapnel shift when she moved too fast, a reminder that heroism and pain were often indistinguishable from the outside looking in. Morrison sent her a message every Sunday, "Still breathing, Chief." She always replied the same way, "Keep it that way, operator." As Katie walked down the stairs toward the ER, Emma called after her one more time. "Mom, my teacher asked what you do." Katie paused on the landing, looked back at her daughter silhouetted in the doorway, this girl who had learned the real names of courage and sacrifice. "What did you tell her?" "That you're a nurse. And a warrior. And that you've saved more lives than most people will ever meet." Katie smiled, the first real smile in years, the kind that came from being seen finally, being known, being allowed to exist in the same world as the people she had been ordered to protect. "That's about right." The stairwell door closed behind her. On the roof, the sun cleared the mountains, lighting up the helipad where another broken person waited for hands that remembered how to fix things under fire. The new normal, established. Sometimes the bravest warriors carry stethoscopes, not guns. If you found Katie's story powerful, please subscribe for more stories of hidden heroes, uncover the truth about those who serve in silence, and drop a comment telling us about someone you know who carried a secret strength. What would you have done in Katie's position?